I was the mother of the groom. Yet on my son's wedding day, my daughter-in-law pointed toward a table beside the catering staff and said, "That's where you'll be sitting, Martha." At first, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. While her family smiled from the front row tables, I was escorted to a seat near the kitchen doors, hidden behind a large decorative pillar where hardly anyone could see me. The humiliation burned through my chest. But I sat down without arguing, because Brittany Collins had no idea that every flower, every crystal chandelier, every gourmet meal, and every minute of that luxury wedding had been paid for by me. And before the night was over, everyone would learn the truth. Before I tell you what happened next, welcome to Truth and Dignity Stories. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments, would you have walked out or stayed silent like I did? I would also love to know where you're watching from. My name is Martha Sinclair. For most of my life, I never asked for much. I did not chase luxury. I did not need a big house, expensive vacations, or people telling me how important I was. All I ever wanted was for my son to have a better life than the one I had. I suppose that is what most mothers want. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Columbus, Ohio. It had faded cream siding, a narrow front porch, and a maple tree that dropped too many leaves every October. It was not impressive, but it was home. Every room carried a memory. Some were warm enough to make me smile. Others were painful enough that I still avoided looking at certain photographs. I moved into that house with my husband, Daniel. When we were young and still believed hard work could protect us from anything, Daniel was the kindest man I ever knew. He repaired neighbors' fences without being asked. He brought home grocery store flowers when I had a rough day. And every night, no matter how tired he was, he made sure our little boy knew he had been listened to. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Daniel went to work and never came home. He died from a heart attack. At 43, I can still hear the rain striking the porch roof that evening. I can still see the police officer standing at my front door with his cap in both hands. And I can still remember looking past him toward the kitchen table, where Ethan was doing his 4th grade math homework. He was 9 years old. He did not know that in one sentence, his childhood was about to split into before and after. The months that followed were a blur of bills, grief, and exhaustion. I worked at a clothing alteration counter in a department store during the day, then took extra sewing jobs at night. Brides brought me gowns that cost more than my car. Businessmen brought me suits with torn linings. Parents brought me school uniforms 2 days before class began and begged me to make them fit. Eventually, I saved enough to open a small alteration shop of my own. The sign above the door read, "Sinclair Alterations." Nothing glamorous, just a neat little shop with 2 fitting rooms, a battered oak counter, and a sewing machine that hummed like an old friend. But it fed us. It kept the lights on. It let Ethan stay in the same school district after his father died. Some nights, I stitched until my fingertips were sore and my shoulders felt like stone. I wore the same winter coat for 6 years. I said no to vacations. I packed leftovers for lunch. And whenever a customer paid late, I simply found another way to stretch what I had. Because every sacrifice had Ethan's face attached to it. When he was 16, he got a part-time job at a grocery store. I never asked him to. One Friday night, he came home and placed $200 on the kitchen table. "Mama," he said, "you've carried us long enough?" I cried after he went to bed. Not because of the money, because I knew then that I had raised a good man. Ethan worked hard. He earned scholarships. He graduated from college with honors and became a civil engineer. He was steady, thoughtful, and decent. The kind of man who called every Sunday, remembered birthdays, and drove 3 hours just to take me out for dinner when he got his first promotion. For years, Ethan was not only my son, he was my closest friend. That was why I never expected him to drift away from me. The first change came when he called one evening with excitement trembling in his voice. "Mom," he said, "I met someone." I laughed. "Well, it's about time." Her name was Brittany Collins. At first, I was happy for him. Truly happy. I wanted Ethan to have love. I wanted him to build a family of his own. I wanted someone to stand beside him through the years, the way Daniel had stood beside me. A few weeks later, Ethan invited me to dinner to meet her. I remember spending too long choosing a blouse. I was not trying to impress anyone. I just wanted Brittany to understand that she mattered to me because she mattered to my son. When I arrived, Ethan stood and hugged me. His smile filled the restaurant. Beside him sat Brittany. She was beautiful, polished, and dressed with the kind of effortless elegance that made every other person at the table glance at their own clothes. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her makeup was flawless. Her smile was warm enough to pass for kindness. At least for a while. Dinner went smoothly on the surface. We talked about Ethan's work, Brittany's job in marketing, travel, and the future, but every now and then, I noticed a pause before she answered me. A look that disappeared when Ethan turned his head. A tiny tightening around her smile. Whenever I mentioned my shop, years of dealing with customers had taught me something important. People could say almost anything politely. It was what their face did after they said it that told the truth. Still, I ignored the feeling. I told myself I was being protective. I told myself I was simply afraid of sharing my son with another woman. Then the Sunday calls started becoming less frequent. A dinner was canceled because Brittany had plans. A holiday visit became shorter because they needed to attend one of her family's events. Then Ethan stopped calling for nearly 2 weeks. When I finally reached him, and he apologized and said work had been busy, I believed him. Because I wanted to believe him. But after we hung up, I sat alone on my porch and looked at the empty chair beside me. It was the chair Daniel used to sit in. Later, it became Ethan's chair whenever he came over for dinner. That evening, it stayed empty. I did not know it then, but my loneliness was only the beginning. A few months after I met Brittany, she invited me to dinner with her parents. Ethan sounded relieved when he told me, "They're excited to meet you, Mom." Brittany stood beside him on speakerphone and added, "My mother has been looking forward to it." Looking back, I do not think that was true. The Collins family lived in an upscale suburb outside Cincinnati. Their home was enormous, with white stone columns, a circular driveway, and landscaping so perfect it looked artificial. A black luxury SUV sat beneath the covered entrance. I arrived carrying a homemade peach pie. It was my mother's recipe. Sweet peaches, cinnamon, a little nutmeg, and a crust I had learned to make before I was 10. I brought it because I was raised to never arrive at someone's home empty-handed. Victoria Collins opened the door. She was tall, elegant, and perfectly composed, with blonde hair that did not move even when she did. For half a second, she looked at me. Then, at the pie in my hands, something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment. Then her smile returned. "Martha," she said. "How lovely." The words were pleasant. The tone was not. Inside, the house looked like a furniture catalog. Marble floors, crystal lighting, fresh white flowers on every table. Nothing out of place. Nothing personal enough to suggest anyone ever relaxed there. Richard Collins, Brittany's father, shook my hand. He seemed quieter than his wife. Not unkind. Exactly. just practiced at disappearing whenever Victoria took control of a room. Dinner began politely. Richard asked Ethan about engineering projects. Brittany talked about a recent campaign she had worked on. Victoria mentioned a charity auction and several people I had never heard of. Then she turned to me. "And what did you do before retirement?" "Martha? I owned an alterations shop," I said. "For almost 30 years. "Oh." That single word carried more judgment than a speech. "I suppose working with your hands must be satisfying." I smiled. It was. It also paid for a house, a college education, and more meals than I can count. For the first time, Victoria's smile tightened. Brittany looked down at her plate. I should have seen that moment clearly for what it was. But I still wanted peace. I still wanted Ethan's future to be simple and happy. So I let it go. Then Victoria looked at Brittany's phone, where she had been showing pictures from a work conference in New York. "You've always belonged in that world," Victoria told her daughter. "You understand quality? You understand what a beautiful life should look like." She smiled at me across the table. "Not everyone does." Richard quietly reached for his water. Ethan did not seem to notice. Brittany said nothing. And that was the part I remembered most. People reveal their character not only through the cruel things they say. Sometimes they reveal it through the cruel things they let happen. The comments continued over the next year. At a department store, Brittany helped me look for a dress to wear to Ethan's company awards banquet. I found a navy blue dress that fit well and cost less than $200. Brittany barely glanced at it. "No," she said. "That's too plain." "I like plain," I told her. She walked to another rack and pulled out a designer gown. The price tag was nearly $600. I stared at it. That is more than I spent on groceries in some months when Ethan was growing up. Brittany laughed. Not loudly, but she laughed. "Well," she said, "that might explain why you never developed a real sense of fashion." I waited for her to apologize. She never did. A few months later, Ethan proposed to her during a trip to Napa Valley. He called me moments after she said yes. His voice was full of joy, and I forced myself to match it. He deserved happiness. But deep down, I was afraid that Brittany did not love the man Ethan was. I feared she loved the life she believed he could give her. That fear grew when wedding planning began. One evening, Ethan came to my house and sat at the same kitchen table where he had once done homework. He looked exhausted. Not tired from work. Tired from carrying something heavy alone. "The wedding budget is getting out of control," he finally admitted. He pushed several folders toward me. The venue cost more than I had paid for my house. The floral estimate was enough to buy a reliable car. The catering proposal included imported seafood, champagne towers, and a late-night dessert station Brittany had described as essential. I looked at Ethan. "Why does it have to be this expensive?" He lowered his eyes. "Brittany wants something special." "And her parents?" He did not answer. That answer told me everything. A few days later, I attended a meeting at a luxury hotel with Brittany, Victoria, Ethan, and the wedding planner, Lauren Bennett. Victoria wanted upgraded lighting, imported crystal centerpieces, a custom dance floor, and orchids flown in from another state. Every suggestion added thousands of dollars. But whenever Lauren mentioned deposits, Victoria's face changed. Only for a second. "Still," I noticed. Then Lauren asked, "Have the financial responsibilities been finalized among the families?" The room went quiet. Victoria looked at Richard. Richard looked at Brittany. Brittany looked at Ethan. And Ethan looked down at the table. That night, he called me. "Mom," he said softly, "would you ever expect someone you loved to take out a loan for a wedding?" My heart broke. "No," I said, "Never." There was silence on the other end. Then he whispered, "I've been looking at one." After we hung up, I sat awake in my living room until nearly dawn. I thought about Daniel. I thought about how hard Ethan had worked to build a stable life. And I thought about the Collins family, with their perfect house, polished smiles, and expensive opinions. The next afternoon, the wedding planner called me by mistake. She thought I was someone from the Collins family. "There's a problem with one of the deposits," Lauren said. "We need an answer today." I asked careful questions. By the end of that call, I understood something that changed everything. The Collins family was not paying for the wedding. They were not even capable of paying for the wedding they were demanding. Behind the luxury cars, the country club conversations, and Victoria's constant talk about status was a mountain of debt, refinancing, and appearances held together by fear. And Ethan, my son, he was preparing to borrow money so Brittany's family could pretend they were richer than they were. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the old family ledger where I had recorded every dollar I had saved since Daniel died. Then I made a decision. I would protect Ethan from a debt he did not deserve, but I would do it quietly. And I would not tell Brittany or her mother that I was the one paying. Not yet. I had no idea that my silence would one day place me beside the kitchen doors at my own son's wedding. And I had no idea what I would find when I finally opened the folder Lauren had accidentally sent to my email. The attachment from Lauren arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. Its subject line read, "Final payment, schedule Collins, Sinclair wedding." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was the venue contract. The second was an itemized list of vendors. The third was a payment ledger that told a much uglier story than I had expected. The Collins family had paid only the initial reservation fee. Everything else had been delayed, divided, postponed, or quietly shifted toward Ethan. There were notes besides several balances. Awaiting groom's family confirmation. Client requested discretion. Do not discuss with bride's mother unless necessary. I read those lines twice. Then I saw a message from Victoria to Lauren, written only 3 days earlier. "Ethan's mother has a small business. I'm sure she understands that family support is expected during these occasions." My hands went cold. She had not asked me for help. She had simply decided I would provide it. And somehow, that made it worse. For several minutes, I sat alone in my kitchen with the papers spread out in front of me. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock Daniel had bought at a yard sale during our first year of marriage. I could have called Ethan immediately. I could have told him what I knew. I could have marched over to Brittany's apartment and placed those documents in front of her mother. But anger has a way of pushing people into decisions they regret later. I had spent too much of my life learning how expensive impulsive choices could be. So I waited. Then I called the one person I trusted to help me think clearly. His name was Harold Price. He had been Daniel's friend long before I met either of them. After Daniel died, Harold had helped me understand the insurance paperwork, the mortgage, and the small savings account Daniel had left behind. He was not a lawyer, and he never pretended to be one, but he had worked in financial planning for more than 30 years. And he had a gift for asking the questions people hoped nobody would ask. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Martha, are you thinking about paying for this wedding?" "I'm thinking about protecting Ethan from making a mistake that could follow him for years." "That is not the same thing." "No," I said softly. "It isn't." Harold asked me to come by his office the next morning. His office was small and plain, with framed certificates on the wall and a coffee machine that always smelled faintly burnt. He looked through the wedding documents slowly, taking notes in the margins. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Your son's income is stable, he said. But this kind of loan could affect his ability to buy a home. It could limit his choices for years. I know. And the Collins family? They want people to think they are hosting the wedding. Harold folded his hands. Then if you decide to help Ethan, protect yourself, too. I looked at him. What do you mean? Do not hand money to people who have already shown you that appearances matter more to them than honesty. The words stayed with me. Over the next week, I made a decision that was both loving and foolish. Loving, because I did it for my son. Foolish, because I believed doing the right thing quietly would protect everyone from embarrassment. I used part of the savings Daniel and I had built over the years. I sold a small investment account I had kept for emergencies. I also used the money from the sale of my alteration shop, which I had closed only 6 months earlier, after arthritis made it harder to work long hours. That shop had been my life for nearly 3 decades. Every dollar from it represented a hem sewn at midnight, a wedding gown repaired before dawn, a mother's school uniform emergency, or a customer who trusted me with something important. But Ethan was important. So I told Lauren I would cover the remaining wedding costs directly through the vendors. Not through Brittany, not through Victoria, and not through Ethan. Lauren sounded relieved. Martha, she said carefully, are you sure you want to do this? No, I answered honestly, but I'm sure I don't want my son beginning his marriage in debt. We created a simple arrangement. I would pay the vendors directly. Every invoice would be documented. Every payment would be confirmed in writing. Lauren agreed to keep my name confidential until I decided otherwise. She did not know that I was not trying to receive credit. I was trying to avoid conflict. The first few payments went through without a problem. The venue was paid. The caterer was paid. The photographer, florist, musicians, lighting company, and rental firm all received their deposits. Every time an invoice was cleared, Victoria somehow became more demanding. She added a champagne wall, then a custom monogram dance floor, then late-night cigar service for certain guests, then a second floral installation for the entrance, because the first one was, in her words, not memorable enough. At one planning meeting, I watched her circle an additional arrangement of white orchids in a catalog. These, she said. They need these. Lauren hesitated. That would add another $8,000. Victoria looked at Brittany. Your wedding only happens once. I watched Brittany's face. For a moment, she looked uncertain. Then she nodded. Yes, she said. Add them. I did not say a word. But later, when Lauren called to ask whether I wanted to approve the change, I told her no. Do not add anything else without my written consent, I said. She sounded relieved again. That was when I realized Lauren had been trying to hold the line for months. The closer the wedding came, the more Brittany changed around me. Or perhaps she had always been that way, and I had simply run out of excuses for her. At a bridal shower, I arrived early to help set up tables. I brought homemade lemon bars, because Brittany had once told Ethan they were her favorite. She looked at the tray and smiled tightly. Oh, she said, those are sweet. I thought people might enjoy them. I'm sure they will, she replied. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. But please don't put them beside the catered desserts. My mother is very particular about presentation. For a second, I thought she was teasing. She was not. I carried the tray into the kitchen and placed it beside the coffee urn. Later, I watched guests eat every last lemon bar. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me sad. Because the people Brittany worried would judge us did not care about expensive desserts or elegant packaging. They cared about what tasted good. They cared about who made them feel welcome. But Brittany had been taught to see the world differently. One Sunday, Ethan came over for dinner alone. That had become rare. I made pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The same meal he had loved since he was a boy. He ate quietly for several minutes before putting down his fork. "Mom," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Brittany say something to you at the shower?" I paused. "Why would you ask that?" "She said you seemed upset afterward." I looked at my son. He was tired again. The same tiredness I had seen when he first brought me the wedding budget. "She didn't say anything I couldn't handle." I told him. His eyes narrowed. "That isn't an answer." "No," I said. "It's the answer I have right now." He looked down at his plate. Then he said something that hurt more than I expected. "Sometimes I feel like I'm always trying to keep everyone happy." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You cannot build a peaceful life by making yourself smaller every time someone else demands more." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, though I could tell he was not ready to hear the truth beneath my words. The wedding was 6 weeks away, when another problem appeared. Lauren called me from the venue. "Martha," she said, "I need to ask you about a payment request." "What kind of request?" "A transfer to a new account. Victoria says the florist asked for the final floral payment to be redirected." My stomach tightened. Did the florist ask for it? "No. I called them. They have no record of a new account." I stood up from my kitchen chair. "Do not transfer anything." "I already placed a hold on the request," Lauren said. "But there's more." She forwarded me an email Victoria had sent from Brittany's laptop. It was written as though it came from Brittany. The message said that Martha Sinclair had agreed to provide additional funds for last-minute family expenses related to the wedding. It included my name. It included a false signature. And it requested $12,000. For a moment, I could not breathe. This was no longer about a wedding. It was no longer about a mother with expensive tastes. Someone had tried to use my generosity as an open door. I called Harold before I called anyone else. He told me to save every email, print the documents, and avoid confronting Victoria without witnesses. "Let the facts speak first," he said. "People like that are often very good at changing the story once they know they have been caught." The next morning, I met Lauren at a quiet coffee shop near the venue. She brought copies of the emails and a timeline of every payment request. She looked nervous. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you sooner how much pressure there has been." "You did what you could," I told her. Then she looked down at her cup. "There's something else you should know." She explained that Brittany had not written the false email. Lauren had checked the timestamp. At the time the message was sent, Brittany had been at a final dress fitting across town. The email had come from her laptop, but not from her. I thought of Victoria. I thought of Richard sitting silently at dinner. And I thought of all the times Brittany had watched her mother's cruelty without speaking. For the first time, I wondered whether Brittany was only selfish, or whether she had spent her whole life being trained to confuse silence with safety. That did not excuse her, but it made the story sadder. I asked Lauren not to involve Ethan yet. "Why not?" she asked. "Because if I tell him before I have everything, he'll feel forced to choose between his mother and his future wife." Lauren looked at me carefully. "And if you wait, then I may have to choose dignity over peace." The wedding week arrived with perfect weather and a kind of tension that nobody else seemed able to see. Brittany walked through every event, smiling for photographs. Victoria greeted guests as though she were hosting a royal celebration. Richard followed behind them, carrying bags and saying very little. Ethan tried to enjoy himself, but I noticed how often he rubbed the back of his neck when Brittany's mother spoke. I noticed how he checked his phone whenever a vendor approached. I noticed how he kept asking me if I was all right. I always told him yes. That was the mistake I had made for too long. I had been so determined not to burden him that I had allowed him to believe there was no burden at all. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private room in an expensive restaurant. Victoria arranged the seating chart herself. My name was placed at the far end of the table, beside two distant cousins who barely knew me. Brittany's parents sat beside Ethan. Brittany sat between them. When Ethan saw the arrangement, he frowned. "Mom should sit near me," he said. Victoria smiled, as if he had said something charming. "Oh, Ethan, everyone needs a chance to visit. Martha will be perfectly comfortable." I watched him hesitate. Then Brittany squeezed his hand beneath the table. He let it go. That moment told me the wedding day would be worse. After dinner, Lauren found me in the hallway. She was holding a white envelope. "I found this in the bridal suite," she said. My name was written across the front in Victoria's handwriting. Inside was a copy of a bank routing form. The same false signature appeared at the bottom. But there was something new on the second page. A note from Victoria to Brittany. It said, "Once the wedding is over, we can finally discuss what Martha should contribute toward your first home. She has no one else to spend it on." I stared at those words until they blurred. No one else. As though my life had no value outside the money I could provide. As though my husband's memory, my home, my work, and my dignity were nothing more than a fund waiting to be claimed. Lauren touched my arm. "What do you want to do?" I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I looked toward the ballroom doors, where I could hear my son laughing with people who had no idea what was being planned behind his back. "I want to make sure the wedding goes forward," I said. Lauren looked surprised. "But after that," I continued, "no one will ever use my silence against me again." The next morning, I dressed in my best navy blue suit and pinned Daniel's gold brooch near my collarbone. Then I placed every invoice, every email, every payment record, and Victoria's note into a leather folder. I did not know yet that I would be seated beside the kitchen doors. But I knew something else. By the end of that day, I would no longer be the quiet woman they believed they could take from. The wedding morning began with sunlight pouring through my kitchen window. For a few minutes, I stood at the counter holding a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. My leather folder rested beside the sugar bowl, closed and silent. Inside it were the records of every payment I had made. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the lighting, the photographer, the musicians, the rental furniture, the fireworks Brittany had chosen after telling everyone she had dreamed of them since she was a little girl. There were also the emails Victoria had sent, the false bank transfer form, the forged signature, and the note about my supposed responsibility for their future home. I could have opened that folder at any moment during the previous week. I could have shown Ethan the truth before he put on his tuxedo. But I had made a promise to myself. I would not ruin my son's wedding out of anger. I would not turn his happiest day into a battlefield unless someone forced me to. Still, I would not allow anyone to humiliate me again. That was the difference. I slipped Daniel's gold brooch into place, picked up my folder, and drove to the venue. The ballroom was even more beautiful than I remembered. White flowers climbed the walls. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across the polished floor. Tables glittered with candles and gold-rimmed glassware. Every inch of it had been paid for with the life I had spent working. Not because I wanted praise, because I loved my son. When I arrived, a young venue coordinator greeted me near the entrance. "Mrs. Sinclair?" she asked. "Yes." She checked a clipboard and smiled politely. "Your seat is this way?" I followed her through the ballroom. At first, I did not understand where we were going. We passed the family tables. We passed the front row, where Brittany's parents, her cousins, and her closest friends were all seated near the dance floor. Then we reached the far side of the room, near the service doors. Beside the catering station, a large decorative pillar blocked half the view of the ceremony space. The coordinator gestured toward a small table with 2 empty chairs. "This is your seat?" I looked at the chair. Then I looked back toward the front tables. For a moment, I said nothing. I simply stood there, holding my leather folder against my side. Then Brittany appeared behind us. She was already in her wedding gown, surrounded by 2 bridesmaids. Her face was flawless. Her veil glowed beneath the ballroom lights. She looked exactly like the kind of bride people would remember in photographs. When she saw me, she smiled. "There you are," she said. "I wanted to make sure you found your table." I looked at her. "Is this really where you want me to sit?" Her smile shifted slightly. "It's only for the ceremony and dinner." The seating was complicated. Complicated? Brittany glanced toward the front tables. "My family has a lot of guests, and this keeps things balanced." Balanced. That word landed quietly. I looked at the chair again. The staff moved around behind it, carrying trays and adjusting silverware. The kitchen doors opened and closed every few seconds. Guests walking into the room would barely notice I was there. Then Brittany leaned closer. "Please don't make this difficult today, Martha." I felt something inside me go still. Not angry, not broken. Still. For years, I had confused peace with swallowing every insult. I had believed that being a good mother meant protecting Ethan from every uncomfortable truth. But standing beside that chair, hidden behind a pillar at a wedding I had paid for, I understood something Daniel would have understood long before I did. Kindness without boundaries becomes permission. I looked Brittany in the eyes. "I won't make anything difficult," I said, "but I will not pretend this is respectful." Her expression hardened. "Martha, everyone is waiting." "Yes," I said. "They are." Then I sat down, not because I accepted the seat, because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. A few minutes later, Ethan entered the ballroom with his groomsmen. He looked handsome, nervous, and so much like Daniel that my chest tightened. He scanned the room. At first, he did not see me. Then his eyes found the table near the kitchen. His smile faded. He started walking toward me, but Victoria stepped into his path. I could not hear every word she said, but I saw her touch his arm and point toward the officiant. The ceremony was about to begin. Ethan looked at me again. I gave him a small nod. "Go ahead." He did. And that was the moment I knew I would not protect everyone anymore. I would protect myself. The ceremony began. Brittany walked down the aisle on Richard's arm. The guests stood. The music swelled. People smiled and dabbed their eyes. I watched my son look at his bride with love. Not performance. Not status. Love. That was why my heart hurt. Because he deserved a wife who saw the goodness in him. He deserved a family that honored the woman who had raised him. He deserved to begin his marriage without being caught between shame, money, and someone else's hunger for appearances. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the ballroom erupted in applause. Brittany kissed Ethan. Victoria lifted her chin proudly. And I sat beside the kitchen doors, hidden behind a pillar, with a folder full of truth on my lap. During cocktail hour, Lauren came to find me. She had seen the seating arrangement. Her face was pale. "Martha," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. I asked Victoria whether this was intentional, and she said you preferred a quiet table." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the lie was so easy for her to tell. "She said I preferred this?" Lauren nodded. I opened the folder and handed her the first page of the payment ledger. Her eyes moved across the list. Then she looked up at me. "Do you want me to tell Ethan?" No, I said. Not alone. I showed her Victoria's false transfer request, the forged signature, and the note about my home. Lauren's hand began to shake. This is serious. Yes? Should we call security? Not yet. I did not want a scene. I did not want shouting. I did not want my son's wedding remembered as the day police officers entered a ballroom. But I did want witnesses. Lauren understood. She quietly asked the venue manager, the accounting director, and the catering manager to meet in a private conference room upstairs. These were the people who had received my payments. The people who knew exactly whose account had covered the event. Then she asked Brittany, Victoria, Richard, and Ethan to join us. Ethan arrived first. He looked confused. Mom, what's going on? I held his hand for 1 second. Please sit down. Sweetheart. Brittany came in next, still smiling at first. Then she saw the folder on the table. The smile disappeared. Victoria was last. She took one look at the people in the room and immediately knew something was wrong. What is this? She asked. Lauren stood beside the conference table. This is a financial clarification, she said carefully. Victoria gave a short laugh. On a wedding day? Yes, I said. On a wedding day? Ethan looked between us. Mom? I opened the folder. The room became silent. I placed the payment ledger in front of him. At first, he did not understand what he was seeing. Then he read the names of the vendors. He read the amounts. He saw the bank confirmations. His face changed. Mom, he whispered. You paid for all of this? I nodded. I paid directly to keep you from taking out that loan. He looked stunned. Then he looked at Brittany. Brittany's lips parted. But she said nothing. Victoria stepped forward. This must be some misunderstanding. Lauren calmly slid the venue's accounting records across the table. There is no misunderstanding. Mrs. Collins, every major vendor payment came from Martha Sinclair. Richard closed his eyes. I saw his shoulders drop. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Brittany looked at me. You paid for the wedding? Yes. Why didn't you tell us? I swallowed. Because I did not want Ethan to begin his marriage under debt. And because I hoped the gift would be enough without anyone needing to know my name. Her eyes filled with tears. Victoria, quicklisting, reached for the documents. This is ridiculous. We were always going to contribute. But Lauren placed the next page in front of her. The false transfer request. Victoria's face went white. Ethan looked down at it. What is this? No one answered. He read the email. He read the request for $12,000. Then he saw the signature. He looked at me. Mom, you didn't sign this? No. His eyes moved to Victoria. Did you do this? Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Brittany stared at her mother. Mom? Victoria straightened her shoulders. I was trying to solve a problem. What problem? Ethan asked. Her voice became sharp. The problem that this wedding was becoming expensive, and no one was taking responsibility. I looked at her. You mean no one except me? Victoria's face flushed. You had the money? The room went still. There it was. Not an apology. Not shame. The truth beneath every comment she had ever made. She believed my money belonged to her because she had decided my life did not matter as much as her image. Ethan's voice broke. You forged my mother's signature? Victoria looked toward Brittany. I was thinking about your future. Brittany stepped back as if she had been struck. My future? You and Ethan need a home. Victoria said. Martha has no one else to spend her money on. I felt the words hit the room. Richard lowered his head. Lauren turned away. And Ethan looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then Brittany spoke. No. Victoria froze. Brittany shook her head slowly. No. Mom. Don't say that. For the first time since I had met her, Brittany did not sound polished. She sounded frightened. You told me Martha didn't want to be involved, she said. You told me she thought our plans were too much. You told me she didn't understand the kind of wedding we wanted. Victoria said nothing. Brittany looked at the records again, then at me. And all this time, she was paying for it. I did not answer. I did not need to. Ethan stood up from his chair. His face was pale, but his voice was clear. This wedding is not a reason to steal from my mother. Victoria flinched. I didn't steal anything. You tried to. The words were quiet. That made them stronger. Ethan turned to Lauren. Please make sure no more money moves through my mother's account or under her name. Lauren nodded immediately. Then he looked at me. Mom? I'm sorry. That was the moment I almost cried. Not because I needed him to apologize, because I could see how deeply he was hurting. He had just learned that the woman he loved had watched me be diminished, and that her mother had tried to take advantage of me. I stood and touched his cheek. This is not your shame to carry, I told him, but it is your truth to face. Brittany began to cry, quietly at first, then hard enough that she had to sit down. I knew the seating was wrong, she said. I knew it was cruel. No one interrupted her. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself you would understand. I told myself I had to keep my family happy. She looked at me. But I humiliated you. Yes, I said. The room stayed silent. I was ashamed of you, she whispered. Not because of who you are. Because of what I thought people would think. I took a slow breath. That is the same thing. Brittany. She covered her face. Victoria looked away. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Richard spoke. His voice was low and tired. She learned it from us? Victoria turned toward him. Richard. No, he said. Not this time. He looked at Brittany. Your mother and I spent too many years teaching you that appearances were more important than character. And I spent too many years staying quiet when I should have stopped it. Victoria's eyes filled with anger. But beneath that anger was something else. Fear. Because the story she had built around herself was collapsing, I looked at Lauren. Please keep copies of all the records. She nodded. Then I looked at Victoria. I will speak with my attorney after the wedding. I am not making a decision in this room. But you will not contact my bank. Use my name. Or ask for money again. Victoria stared at me. I held her gaze. And you will not treat my home, my savings, or my life as though they exist for your convenience. She had no answer. A few minutes later, the venue manager quietly left the room to give us privacy. The celebration downstairs continued, unaware that upstairs, a family had finally been forced to look at itself honestly. Brittany wiped her face. Then she stood. I need to fix the seating, she said. Ethan looked at her. She nodded toward me. No, I need to fix what I did. When we returned to the ballroom, the music lowered, and the guests watched us with curious faces. Brittany walked to the microphone in the center of the room. Her hands were shaking. I need everyone's attention, she said. The room became quiet. She looked directly at me. Today, I treated my mother-in-law with disrespect. I placed her at a table where she did not belong. And I did it because I cared more about appearances than kindness. Whispers moved through the crowd. Victoria stood near the back of the room, rigid and silent. Brittany continued. Martha Sinclair is the reason this wedding was possible. She did not ask for recognition. She did not ask for praise. but she deserved dignity from the beginning. Then she stepped down from the stage and walked across the ballroom. She stopped in front of me. "Martha," she said, her voice breaking, "will you please come sit beside your son?" I looked at her for a long moment. An apology did not erase everything. It did not repair the months of cold comments, the hidden cruelty, or the chair beside the kitchen doors. But it was honest, and honesty was where healing had to begin. I took her hand. The ballroom applauded as Ethan pulled out the chair beside him at the family table. Then he kissed my forehead, just as he had when he was a little boy. The rest of the evening was not perfect. Victoria left early. Richard stayed behind and quietly apologized before he went home. Brittany sat beside me during dinner, nervous and subdued. She did not expect me to comfort her. For once, she simply listened. 3 weeks later, Harold helped me meet with an attorney. I did not pursue revenge, but I did protect myself. My bank added extra verification to my accounts. My attorney sent Victoria a formal notice stating that she was not authorized to discuss access or make requests involving my finances. And I updated my estate plan, not to punish Ethan, but to make sure no one could ever pressure him or manipulate him through my wishes again. Brittany came to my house one quiet Saturday afternoon. No wedding dress, no expensive makeup, no audience. She stood on my porch holding a small box of peach tea. "I wanted to bring something," she said. "I didn't know what you liked." I almost smiled. "Tea is fine." We sat in my kitchen for nearly 2 hours. She apologized again. But this time she did not make excuses. She did not blame her mother. She did not blame stress, weddings, or fear. She simply said, "I was wrong." And I believed she meant it. Forgiveness did not happen all at once. Real forgiveness is not a door someone walks through because they finally said the right words. It is a path built through changed behavior, honest choices, and time. Brittany began that work. So did Ethan. And so did I. Because I had to learn something, too. Silence can keep peace for a little while. But silence can also teach people that they are allowed to disrespect you. Today, the chair beside my kitchen window is no longer empty as often as it once was. Ethan and Brittany come for Sunday dinner sometimes. Not every week. Life is busy. Marriage is complicated. Healing takes time. But when they come, Brittany helps me set the table. She always places a chair beside Ethan's. And she never lets me sit anywhere except where family belongs. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Truth and Dignity Stories, and share it with someone who believes kindness should never require accepting disrespect. And tell me in the comments, if you were Martha, would you have revealed the truth at the wedding? Or walked away without saying a word?